Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Kessling. I'm the Dean of the Inns of Court College of Advocacy, or ICCA, as most of us call it, because it is so much easier. It's an absolute pleasure to see you today. I was waiting a few seconds at the beginning just for people to join. It's my pleasure to welcome you, particularly today because it's World Mental Health Day, to Jody Tobin, who will give a far greater introduction herself in a few moments. But Jody will be presenting today our webinar, Mind Your Language, a guide. A guide to bar training and neurodiversity, and I'm really excited to hear this. Jody was a student at the Inns of Court College of Advocacy. She graduated recently, being called to the bar in literally, I think, next week, Jody. Jody can tell you all about that. And Jody's working with us, in fact, this year, helping us improve the course in all manner of ways. So I'm going to hand over to Jody. Let me just say, please feel free to ask questions. Use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. You can find that at the bottom of your screen when you move your cursor. And Jody has left some space at the end of this webinar to answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Another reminder, for anyone else that you know who'd like to watch this, this is being recorded. And it will be, I think we've got someone who's just joined. I wonder if that's also the same. I wonder if you could remove yourself from the screen. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much. Jody, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to share my screen if you bear with me. Share. And then... So, thank you for joining this webinar on neurodiversity. This presentation is particularly for anyone who's neurodiverse looking to study the bar course, anyone who works with neurodiverse students, and anyone who intends to work with a neurodiverse community. So in essence, this webinar is for everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to explain what neurodiversity is, how communication and thought processes differ, the common issues at the bar that causes. Then I'm going to go into learning styles and how to make them work for you on the bar course, and some tips and tricks for the bar course parts 1 and 2. So first of all, I'd like you to draw a box. Now that sounds like a simple question, and some of you right now will have done so in your head or on paper or with gestures. Either is appropriate, and quite a lot of you may have just done what I've just done there. However, some of you may be asking why or what is the purpose. And if I tell you that it's to show how your brain deciphers and creates information, then you may come up with something like this. So one of those responses is neurotypical and one of those is neurodiverse. So the neurotypical response is to draw a box with your hand. The neurodiverse response needs more information because it is creating something more intricately visual. And what happens is that people will think, from a neurodiverse perspective, that the neurotypical response is that, in fact, it's a square. Therefore, that's wrong. Whereas a neurotypical response could likely be that, well, you've asked me to draw a box, that's a tick box. There's nothing wrong with that, and you've overcomplicated what a box should be. And that is how different brain languages work. And it's the same thing as if you're speaking in English or you're speaking in French and you're trying to have a conversation. One of you may think that one particular translation is correct, and the other may think the other translation is correct. And that's where the miscommunication lies. But is either wrong? Well, no, they're both boxes. So what is neurodiversity? Well, neurodiversity in essence is there to describe anything or anyone with a neurological condition. And a lot of the ones that I have up here, like autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and ADHD and ADD, are some of those. but it also includes epilepsy, it includes motor neuron disease, it includes anything that is neurologically inclined. However, the neurodiversity word was coined by somebody called Jody Singer, who was a sociologist, and she is autistic, and she wanted to describe a less medical model version of what neurodiversity is. So neurodiversity was there to mean that they are normal, natural differences and variations in how a brain works. And it's not a deficit, it's not a disorder, and it's not an impairment. So neurotypical then means this describes someone with a common type of brain language, which is more socially inclined. It is seen, in essence, as a majority brain language, which is why it's neurotypical. And then we have a third description, which is neurodivergent. Well, neurodivergent, in essence, is another term for someone who's not neurotypical. And that was just to differentiate between the neurodiverse and the neurotypical, because in essence, neurodiversity, like diversity and inclusion, really means everybody. I then add in a third characteristic where I describe neurohybrid or neuroneutral people. And that is because some people have little traits of neurodiverse things, and they have little traits of neurohybrid, neurotypical, but they also have things called dialects. So they're two different languages, the neurodivergent brain language and the neurotypical language. And then in between you have dialects, the same as you can be an English person that has a northern accent, for example. So in essence, when I teach about diversity as a whole, so when I'm teaching about gender or sexuality or neurodiversity, I tend to use a spectrum. And that explains that there are poles, so neurodivergent being one pole and neurotypical being the opposite. And somewhere along the line, you will land whether you are an extreme or in the middle, and most people lie somewhere in the middle. And then, of course, those dialects inform how your language works. But neurodiversity always has that base brain language, so you will either be more of a neurodivergent person or more of a neurotypical person. So what does it mean? Well, the medical model of disability is that neurodiverse people have disorders, as we have described earlier, that their brain, therefore, is abnormal. And this signals, if I use Dr. Eric Shepard's research when he did investigative interviewing and created the PEACE model, is it signals an up-down relationship, which means that the person who is neurotypical, therefore, is the more dominant and therefore the more superior, and the person who is therefore different is inferior. And that means that they feel less capable than their peers and are seen as such. And the result of that is the assumption that a neurodiverse person is less intelligent, that they are made to feel inadequate because, of course, they're speaking in a different language, and therefore they're less likely to succeed, whether that be in education or professionally. And both sides tend to be frustrated, the same as if I was speaking to somebody in fluent Welsh and they were trying to speak to me in English and neither of us understood each other's languages. It's always going to lead to misconception. So the social model of disability, therefore, with a bit of my twist, is that neurodiversity is a brain language, of which there are many. And what is culturally normal for us as neurodiverse people is not necessarily culturally normal for somebody who is neurotypical. Trying to work in or translate to another incompatible brain language impairs neurodiverse persons, therefore giving them a more difficult and impaired experience. So the result is that a neurodiverse or neurotypical person is completely equal. They just work in different ways and in different languages. And therefore, if we can actually talk to each other in more compatible or ways, then the impairment will be removed and we'll be much more in harmony. And that means that everybody succeeds and everybody is able to get on as a team. So where the problems occur, and I've broken this down and able to pick out some key areas using a computer format to describe a brain language in essence as a processor. So some of the key areas I've highlighted, therefore, are just general principles, because every brain is unique and every brain is equal, because each person will have a different experience of how their brain works, and they will have different dialects themselves. So information processing is one of the topics I pick up. And this is the way the brain processes information. And this is different for everyone. But of course, we have those commonalities. However, because we're trying to speak in a different language, or our language, to another person, information, as it would be in a verbal language, is either lost or misunderstood, which leads to confusion or sometimes frustration. From a social interaction perspective, some brain language require overt movements and signals to understand emotions or intentions. Others will work on more subtle cues and find overt signals offensive, the same as a lot of cultural gestures don't mean the same thing from country to country. And there are often then translation problems when one language tries or expects another to communicate in the same way. Touch is another part of a cultural social interaction. And just as some gestures are offensive again, so too is touch in other brain languages. Some prefer to show touch as affection or comfort or kindness or allyship, but to others it's completely unwelcome. And one of the ways to give an example of this is that when a social interaction is acceptable, for example in sport, it's perfectly acceptable to throw yourself on top of a teammate and give them a good old cuddle if they've scored. Whereas, if halfway through the match somebody decides to turn to their teammate, dive on them and cuddle them because they passed the ball, it's seen as quite odd and probably slightly suspicious. Structure is another way that we deal with things. So the way our brains structure, form, or process language is individual. And that is to their own language, in the same way that tenses will differ from Latin languages to English, or English to Celtic languages, or beyond. No way is better, but all should be treated as equal. So, to talk through the different languages. So I've put them down into two main languages, the neurodivergent or autistic language and the neurotypical language. And then I discuss the dialects which land in between. So the autistic mind, which is like mine, a high-powered sensory processor. So this means it's capable of lightning speed rendering and processing. In essence, this means that my mind is so powerful that although I'm blind, it will render the information around me in order to create an immersive experience for me and render people's faces so it feels as though I'm not blind. I don't actually see what's there, but my brain fills in the gap in a split second. However, because it's such a sensory and such a powerful mechanism, a bit like having a Formula One McLaren between my ears, is that it has a tendency to overload. It needs a soft touch and minuscule adjustments. So when it's processing large amount of information, it's also hard to articulate reasons. So it often needs additional clarification, as I explained with that box. The autistic mind or the neurodiverse mind was why? What is it for? And often that can be seen as a non-socially acceptable, why am I doing this? But in essence, all it is the neurodiverse person saying, I've rendered the actual scene, I've rendered the box. What I need to know is what is in it and what is it for, so I can give you what you'd like. And that means that they need that additional clarification to refine a response. It also means that when I'm trying to explain myself, because my brain has rendered a situation so clearly, so for example, if I had a problem question where I had to explain to a client whether they were liable for water being dropped onto the road, for example, then my brain would have rendered the house they're outside. It will have created what the smells are. I will be able to understand if there's damp. I will be able to see the trajectory of the raindrop all in a split second. So my question may be, is there moss in the guttering? Which, to a neurotypical person who hasn't run through that process, wonders why on earth I'm asking about moss when they want to know whether or not somebody who slipped and fallen on the road is liable. And that means I have to walk back through my process to explain why I've asked about moss. So the sensory overload that can create is that noisy or busy or colourful environments can cause overstimulation and distress. So you will often see this with autistic people who may, for example, be fidgeting, who may need to move back and forth in order to calm themselves, be wearing ear defenders, or any of the mitigating things in order to calm down the level. And in essence, it is essentially the same as somebody who's listening to a radio. They've put it on, it's blasting, so they've turned it down. And that's what the autistic person is doing. They're running a mitigation process in order to calm that amount of information. So that means social interaction is quite difficult with other brain languages. When an autistic person talks to another autistic person, if I mention moss, they're with me all the way, and they're probably asking me more information about what the guttering looks like. And we will bounce back and forth quite easily. But if I'm talking to somebody who isn't neurodiverse, that is more difficult. So a lot of people who are autistic don't like to make eye contact. And that, again, is a mitigation process in order that they don't have to take in as much information and they can concentrate on what you're trying to say. Most communication between autistic people is very subliminal. It's subtle eye or facial changes. A lot of autistic people don't change the tone of their voice, for example, because it is another level of stimulation on top of what they already have. They don't particularly like overt body language, and they often find it unnatural or often confusing. And sometimes the necessary mitigations that an autistic person has to make, like wearing earmuffs or using with a fidget, or as it's also called stimming, can be seen as odd to more social folks' brain languages. Touch is again a highly sensitive and powerful tool, so it's soothing and fascinating. Lots of people who are autistic like to play with objects when they're trying to calm their senses. But sometimes touch is offensive and they need to withdraw, so it can be quite blunt. So if you try to touch or cuddle an autistic person, especially if they're not in a good mood, they will respond to you the same way as that footballer would halfway through the first half if you dived on them and cuddled them for no apparent reason. Touch is obviously another way of processing and calming themselves. So the structure for an autistic person is articulation and processing are flexible. As I mentioned, I went off on about the moss. It's due to the rapid processor speeds, so it's quite difficult to slow yourself down to explain why you've got to that process. A bit like if you've already learnt to drive, somebody then asking you to explain what you've just done when you've come to a bend, for example, or when you're taking a driving test and your instructor wants you to look up at the mirror in order to show that you've looked, as opposed to you've just glanced because you're used to doing it. So restriction to a forced structure causes problems. It is difficult for expression and a thought process. It is necessary because we have to translate to other people, but it does cause problems. So the neurotypical mind is slightly different. It's an adaptable social processor. So this is a high filtering processor that adapts quickly to situations. It struggles with information displayed in other formats, unfortunately. So what it needs is phrases and sentences. So it tends to pick up things like active listening, and it will excel in a structure. For example, anyone who's neurotypical will be looking to my keywords that I've put up, such as information processing, to explain where I am. And that's a trigger word for the neurotypical person to understand and follow. However, if I give a multiple information source, for example, I jump into different topics, this type of processor may become confused, and it will also miss cues or use if body language or verbal language lacks known trigger formations, for example. Social interaction therefore requires body language to portray mood and expression. There have significant difficulties or discomfort and confusion if incorrect body language is displayed. So a socially acceptable communication is sort of a bit like stimming is for autistic people. It allows for positive feedback and works as a soothing mechanism. So a lot of neurotypical people, for example, when they start an email will say, "I hope you are well," or "How is the weather with you?" Whereas an autistic person is like, "Why am I asking this question? The weather is hazy. I'm not sure what you want from me." So that kind of disconnect is polite when it's a social mechanism, and you have to learn in order to do that when you are not neurotypical. So touch is part of a body language which requires expression of friendship. So two businessmen shaking hands, intimacy or comfort, and that this type of brain language really sees a lack of touch as a rejection or a socially incompatible. It's a discomforting feeling if, for example, you try to shake somebody's hand and they refuse to do so. So the articulation or process must be structured in that specific way because the mind is filtering. So it's a bit like a Simon and Garfunkel song showing my age here, is that a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. It's the same sort of thing. And that allows this language to work in quite amazing, complex environments. They can do lots of different things because they can filter. But any deviation from a structure that they're used to will quickly lead to confusion and frustration. For example, I've deliberately said that a lack of positive feedback or body language being incorrect, and I've said it differently to what's on the slide. So anyone who's neurotypical will have looked at that and gone, is she saying the right thing? And I've done that on purpose to show that I'm using two different forms of information. It overwhelms the neurotypical mind. So as it's socially focused, it likes hierarchy. This processor can become overloaded quickly if an incorrect social response or structure isn't followed. So to the dialects, ADHD or ADD or kinetic processors. So this is a powerful kinetic processor which incorporates the drive to move and tends to run too many processes, which leads to freezing. A bit like if you got too many windows up at the same time and your computer goes, and that's what happens with ADHD. But it does excel in thought whilst in motion. So these people are really good at practical activities. They're really good at sports, whichever kind of works with their brain. However, they really struggle to center on a specific piece of information, so focusing can become quite difficult on particular topics. Social interaction, well, they can do very well at this, particularly if movement is involved, but it can become difficult and stop abruptly. So, for example, one of the key examples of talking to somebody with ADD or ADHD is that you'll be having a conversation with them, and halfway through your sentence, the lights will go out and they'll wander off. And you will be standing there wondering why. And then an hour later, they will come back and continue the conversation they had an hour ago. So as you can imagine, for other brain dialects or languages, that shows a lack of interest. It shows sort of a rejection, and it can be quite confusing. And additional difficulties can occur if somebody is unable to move, depending on what form of ADHD or ADD they have. And that means that they're quite fidgety or distracted in their responses, and they really struggle to sit still. And that means they can't concentrate. So sometimes they will even fall asleep if they have to sit still. And if you work with the neurodiverse community, for example, you will see quite often in, for example, a criminal justice system, people with ADHD, if they are there, they will be unable to sit still. They will be keeping moving, whether they're a barrister, a clerk, or in the dock. They will be moving around and find it very difficult to deal with the court structure, which requires people to sit still. Touch will be dependent on the underlying brain language, and sometimes there can be neurohybrid or neuroneutral. I'll put my teeth back in. And the structure of their own mind and processing is the same as movement and fluid as the mind itself. So it works well with dealing with multiple inputs and darting back and forth, a bit like a social butterfly, but really struggles if you want to pin them down to keep them onto one topic, particularly if the topic is not interesting to them. So dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and dyslexia are brain dialects. So these are highly visual processors that excel with innovative solutions but struggle with incompatible written information. So in essence, people who are dyslexic often think the same way as an autistic person, and because they often think in neurodivergent ways, they can render a picture to the same speed and therefore can think, as they call, outside the box and come up with great solutions. And it's really good with visual orientation, colours and sound, but obviously the written word can cause a lot of difficulties depending on where they are on their own dialect spectrum. So the social interaction will be aligned to their coexisting brain language, because some people who are dyslexic are quite able to work in a neurotypical environment and speak almost both languages with ease. But their written language is processed line by line, not word by word. So subtle changes will therefore cause miscomprehension. So it's a bit like the same as somebody who speaks British Sign Language will do things in a pictorial form as opposed to word by word. So if you try to translate something directly, it doesn't always work. So that works from achieving best evidence. You have to be careful what you ask somebody who is deaf, and therefore when you write something, the dyslexic mind will create the entire sentence, not word for word. That will again be coexisting brain language dependent, but as with those with dyspraxia, which informs physical movement, they may feel clumsy and therefore have difficulty with spatial awareness, for example, and may find touch or activities involving eye or hand or foot coordination more difficult. So as you can imagine, for a barrister, if you've got all your papers in front of you and you're quite conscious of how you move, that can cause you quite socially discomforting moments. And structure, well, as a neurodiverse dialect, it's more visual in structure and more flexible, so may also be hindered by restrictive structures, because what you often find, for example, on a pupillage application is people will pick up where somebody's comma is in the wrong place or the word hasn't been written out correctly, and sometimes that's not a lack of care, but a lack of being able to translate it to a neurotypical precise moment. So what does this mean for the bar? Well, we know that neurodiversity is often classed as EDI as disability. That means only 2% of the people at the bar are currently seen as disabled, and this covers a wide range of impairments or conditions. However, not everyone actually classes themselves as disabled, not everyone answers these forms, and therefore it's quite hard to tell whether people, the actual main number of people that there are. But there are judges, there are KCs and highly experienced barristers throughout the bar who are completely neurodiverse and very proud of it. Joe Delahunty KC, for example, is one of the main speakers for neurodiversity. So, neurotypical traits seem to be championed, our social interaction and group work. But you don't have to be neurodiverse to find group work with people you've never met before a bit awkward, as it would be with anyone. Eye contact and body language, yes, they're more difficult, for example, for a neurodiverse person. But court skills do require practice for everybody, because even neurotypical people will be looking at their notes and trying to concentrate on the witness and their own notes. Off-the-cuff answers to questions which have little context, which is a really difficult thing for autistic people to deal with as they need that extra input. But no one finds this easy, because generally somebody who can answer off the cuff is either an expert or has rehearsed the situation quite extensively. Standing still while advocating and not using your hands. As you can see, I wave my hands around a lot because I am neurodiverse. I would be told off if I was in an advocacy session for doing that. But learning to grip onto the lectern, which is what I did during my course, is one way to work around it, and therefore you don't wave your hands around. Not using filler words is another one. But if you think about it, if you're translating to another language, if I say, for example, a French person is trying to speak English, they make this lovely burring sound when they're trying to think of how the words in their head are going to translate into English. And it's the same with a neurodiverse person or with anyone. But it is a part of natural speech. So learning how to sound more confident is a skill and takes practice for everybody, whether you're neurodiverse or neurotypical. Being able to withstand highly crowded networking events and communicate freely is another big one. But in all fairness, it's awkward for most people. And when I've been to mixed messes, quite often, even people who've been at the bar for years find it incredibly difficult to stand in a room full of strangers and have a conversation. And they usually use little cues and topics that they're used to asking in order to be able to express themselves. So, translating this to the bar course. So my tips and tricks for the bar course are to first talk about the challenges, then talk about how we get around them, and give you some learning styles in order to help you to work through them if you're finding it difficult. So the first thing is there's no way around reading the full materials. As I often say, that they're not only in legalese, they're in proceduralese. It's incredibly difficult to, for example, read the white book from cover to cover and find it riveting, because the idea is that when you're in a case, you will need something particular and you turn to that page and it gives you what you need to do. It's not there as a foundational text as you would have in an undergraduate degree. Those who work less effectively to the written word will need to work around that, and will also need to understand that the materials take a great deal of focus. So if you do have ADHD or any of less capability of focusing on a single task for a length of time, then you will need to work with your processor and not against it. For example, I worked by moving between civil sections and criminal sections and moving back and forth in order to give my brain a rest, because I was more aware and understood criminal law more so. Single best answers are not kind. Unfortunately, they are neurotypical in structure. They require a neurotypical response, and they do require neurotypical processing. And those who are autistic or a hybrid neurodivergent form will need to unpick and analyze how they work. So what I did is I often read the question first at the bottom of the problem in order to understand what I needed to do, so I could almost turn into a neurotypical person and then filter the actual scenario, which helped me to work around. Whereas if I'd read the scenario first, I would have taken in too much information and therefore struggled to answer the question effectively. And the slight difference in words are absolutely vital. So if you are somebody, for example, who's dyslexic and reads line by line, not word by word, you're going to struggle with some sentences. For example, the court may or the court must. It's quite easy to overlook those, and therefore having a text-to-speech function on your laptop will help you with that. The one thing I will say is with part one is that it's absolutely designed to work with all types of learning skills in order to work around these problems. So you have interactive quizzes, you have video storylines. The ICCA have done a wonderful job of putting it into an actual story format from the beginning of the case through to the finish of the case, so you can follow an actual process, which helps work around that. And for example, in part two with ethics, they even give you a bit of a computer game to play, which is fantastic. And it's a way that you can listen to podcasts and you can watch videos, and it works around a lot of these problems as best anyone can give you, which is why we have such an amazing pass rate. And at the ICCA, in addition to that, you can also space out your exams. So for example, if you are somebody who has less able to focus, or you have other things going on in your life, you can take your time to work through one thing at a time in order to pass the exam and focus on that exam and get that out of the way before you do the next part. And what's wonderful about the ICCA is because you're focusing just on the litigation exams first, you're building that foundation. So when you go to part 2, you already have something solid and you're not trying to dart about with too many different subjects. And it really does help. And you don't realize it until you're halfway through part 2 and you think, oh, I know what a part 36 offer is. It comes back to you and it's fantastic. So using learning styles. So for part 1, you will have things like kinesthetic learning styles for all people, and it doesn't matter whether you're neurotypical or neurodiverse. Now that means somebody who likes to break things apart and put things back together. Practical subjects are a strength, and you like things that are movement. The next learning style is audio. So you like to listen to podcasts or people speaking, or sometimes you want to listen to a video. Other people like to watch or read or draw or write. For example, some people like to know how to fix their car, so they watch a YouTube video in order to do it. Other people like to read around the subject or draw or write, and things like mind mapping help. And then we've got verbal reasoning. So verbal reasoning is talking about the subject and explaining it. And as they always say, there's that old adage that the best way to teach yourself something is to teach somebody else. And that helps you to actually break it down into what is relevant and what isn't relevant, which is actually the neurotypical filtering process, which helps you to actually learn it more effectively, which is fantastic. And there can be many subforms of this. You can listen while reading. You can write while moving. You can do all manner of different things. And encompassing all of them on part 1 will really, really help you. So on part 1, the things that you may need. My thing stopped. I've frozen. Right, hang on. Give me a second. So learning styles. No, it's gone. Right. Okay, hang on. Let me just go back in. Apologies. As you can imagine, technology is wonderful. I'm sharing my screen. Good. Right. I'm going to go onto this page. If you can see me. There we go. So we're going to part 2. So apologies for the slight technical difficulty. So part 2, again, will have a neurotypical structure. So many of the assessments will be based on neurotypical structures as required by the BSB, because in essence, that helps you to be confident in a court which often uses neurotypical signals, for example, for confidence. And this will require things like obvious signposting. So they are really good, helpful things that neurotypical people do, which help everyone to understand where you are. So as you can see, I've got them in colours. You will need to signpost all verbal and written forms as neurotypically as possible. So your genuine general submission, you would say, Judge, in introduction, we're here to make an application on so-and-so. I'd like you to find this. The reasons I'd like you to find this are 1, 2, and 3. And that gives a clear format of what you want the judge to do. Remember that neurotypical minds tend to miss information if it's not constructed in a way that triggers understanding. So for example, when I did my undergraduate degree, I had to learn to explain in introduction, in background, in context, in order to give people where I was. And that signposting really helps to work around those missed cues. Talking through your processing is something that everyone will find difficult, whether or not they are neurotypical or neurodiverse. And lots of people find this when they are in pupillage interviews. Somebody asks you a question, you can answer it, but then you have to go back and find out why you've just said what you've said, and it's quite difficult to work back. The same as I said when you're driving, trying to explain why you've just gone down through the gears and put your indicator on and looked in your rear view mirror, for example. So it helps analyze and break down the examples given after each session to work out how the structures are considered best practice. And that's one way to work around how it is. And in part two, you'll get videos that you'll be able to watch of yourself, of your colleagues, and how the tutor has given you feedback. And that allows you to go back and look at and learn how best to present yourself in the most confident and clear manner. Visual representation. When you work on body language, for example, you can get a body language book. Some people do. One of the key things is neurotypical people, for example, see confidence as somebody who is standing legs shoulder width apart. I can't speak. Holding onto a lectern with a very clear, calm voice. That is confident. It's not necessarily how a neurodiverse person would see confidence, because a neurodiverse person may see things as intricate detail would be confident. But that is how in court we present ourselves, because it's a bit like being on a stage and we need our audience to follow us. If you need to move, trying to use less visual movement is best. So, for example, tapping your fingers underneath the lectern without making much of a sound might help. Because if you do move around too much, the same as if I'm waving my hands like this, I'm allowed to do this because it's a webinar. I wouldn't be allowed to do that in advocacy. I'd be told off and my hands would be slapped. So you can use your fidgets where needed. So if you're, for example, doing an opinion writing, or you're listening, or you're doing, for example, drafting, using fidgets to help you process a great deal of information in various ways will make sure that your focus is optimum. And that's essential because you're dealing with something at such a high level of processing and intellectual ability that it is quite difficult to do unless you're helping yourself. And unlike me, try to keep your speech slow and pause for 3 seconds between each section of speech. A lot of the time, this helps people to appear more confident and calmer. It allows people and others in the room to catch up mentally if they have not already done so. So by virtue of the fact this webinar is recorded means I can go through a lot of information, whereas if I was doing this in person, this may take a few hours in order for me to give you the time to process the information. Working with the ICCA is the most important part. The point is everybody's an individual and everybody has individual needs. And you need to make sure that the ICCA are aware of them and help them to understand what you need in order to overcome your obstacles. If you don't quite know, then they may have suggestions that will help you. If you're struggling with certain aspects, make sure to have a conversation with your personal tutor and the student services team to discuss ways you can help yourself. And then, most importantly, especially as it's World Mental Health Day, make sure you look after your well-being. The course is really intense, but it is enjoyable. Exams are never enjoyable for anybody, but the rest of the course is fantastic in that sense. And the exams do actually become quite fun, especially when you get to doing a mock trial. And you take time to look after yourself, take a break and get the right amount of rest, because it is intense, as I've said. But remember that the ICCA want to help you achieve your best potential, and they are open to listening, and they are open to helping. I went through the course and I made sure that I communicated with everybody, and they were really, really helpful and did their best to make sure I succeeded. And due to them working with me, I was able to pass the bar course and did well, and I was very thankful for that. So if you explain any problems you do encounter, then that means that you can really help yourself and help others who will study after you. And I think that's the most important part, is you're helping to give something back. So the part 2 learning styles that will help are finding a case analysis system that works for you. So the ICCA give you an example format, but be sure to look at things like audio or mind mapping that might help your own processor. Try not to think beyond materials if you are autistic. Remember, advocacy skills that you're being required to perform are the bit they're assessing, not necessarily the bits you look outside the box. Writing out questions may help you before you put them into less strict structures if you are somebody who struggles with coming up with off-the-cuff questions. Putting open question formats onto a post-it on your lectern if you're doing examination in chief will help. And working out ways to get what is required from a witness, which is more difficult than it seems, and practicing on others can help, because it is quite difficult to get somebody to allay information without leading them at times. I found that incredibly difficult. And librarians are a great source of assistance if you're doing legal research or you need some help to find practitioners' texts when you're stuck. Don't forget to practice with others or practice with yourself. So you can video yourself and listen, you can work alone, record your own questions, do something else and come back and try not to answer them. You can use the drafting handbook where you can, because that's written material that's given to you. And a general rule for submissions is to do, unlike I'm doing, talk slowly and simply to somebody who seems to be younger or just too busy to listen to you. And remind yourself that this is a practical skill. It's okay to get it wrong. So my tips and tricks: build your support network. So there are WhatsApp groups for each part, aligned to each in. This will help you to know and have people to chat to when you're in a qualifying session. So if you are neurotypical, for example, and like social interaction quite a great deal, then you may find part one quite difficult. So having the WhatsApp group, having someone to talk to and seeing qualifying sessions will work around that, for example. Get your family and friends on board to explain the materials in part one or role play in part two. My mother makes an absolutely amazing armed robber. I'm quite scared by how convincing she can be, but she was wonderful. And it brings a bit of fun into it and a bit of light. Engage with organisations at the bar. So you have All Bar, Bridging the Bar, Bringing Disability to the Bar, Neurodiversity in Law, but a few. Neurodiversity in Law being the one that deals only with neurodiversity, but the others will deal with a spectrum of disabilities or minority groups. These will help you to get used to people who you'll get to know throughout the course, and they will become allies and probably colleagues in the future. And that's one of the parts of the bar that's the really good part of it, is the collegiate side. So make sure to get involved in mentoring schemes if you can. And you'll often meet others who you connect with. So that means that you'll have somebody who's more experienced than you to have a chat to and ask questions. And that is a bit like being in pupillage and asking a baby barrister. The ICCA also has an alumni family. So we aren't scary people who just say, go away, don't talk to me. We're actually really happy to help. And quite often when people come to me and chat to me, I will talk to them about the perils of the white book and marking it up. And anything and other questions they have. We're always happy to help, and we're always happy to help you through the experience of the bar course, because our bar course is completely different. Because don't forget, the ICCA want to make you a barrister. They don't just want to give you an academic qualification. They want to make you somebody who is successful in practice. And remember, you can do it. And I'm cheering for you. And I'm pretty sure most of the ICCA are too, if not all. Depends whether they've had their coffee or not. So the three things I'd like you to remember: there are three essential processes to getting through the bar course. The first is to connect. Find your WhatsApp group. Engage with your family and friends. And engage with organisations. These things will help you offset the part of the bar and being in practice. You need a good support network to help you through it, because it is a pressurised environment. Plug in. So tell the ICCA what you need. If you've noticed you're one of the processes I've mentioned, then you know sort of more of the difficulties you're going to come up against. Help them to help you, because, for example, if you know something particularly works for you and you need that, you can ask for it. The ICCA are open to listening. And be a resource and use your experience to help others who will follow you. So, for example, I'm now part of the ICCA in order to try and give my experience and feedback that I can then improve the course even more for other people. And restore. So your well-being comes first, especially if you're somebody who is autistic. You may find things like burnout and the overload is prevalent, but you can work around them. And remind yourself that everything you've achieved so far when you're struggling. So when you're up against doing a very in-depth opinion piece and it's your mock examination and you're stressed about it, remind yourself that you not only have done a law degree or a GDR and you've passed it with flying colours, you've been sanctioned by the ICCA as somebody they think is promising to be in practice and they believe in you. And you are, at that point, ready to do your mock examinations and going right through to the exams. And you will be called to the bar after it. And that's something to remind yourself that that is quite a mean feat. And you need to be proud of yourself. It's something that you should remember. And again, speak to someone if you need to. Because although we're all training to be barristers, the most important thing is to also understand that it's okay to be human, because we all are. Neurodiverse or not. So that is my whistle through of neurodiversity. So I'm open to questions if you are happy to ask them.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, Jody, that was really, really helpful. Thank you so much. I must tell the audience actually that we don't literally slap waving hands during advocacy, but I do get the point.
Yeah, they do. They get a ruler out and everything. They're awful.
Okay, so we've got one question at the moment. How are the INS and the ICCA supporting neurodiverse students? Do you think that more can be done? Well, I think you've already heard from Jody, really her experience and her hints and tips, really, for making the best out of your bar training. We do a lot. We hope to support neurodiverse students. Just to give you an overview, we have personalized assessment arrangements to help you during your assessments, and we have what are called inclusion plans to help you through the course. They are bespoke. We'll work with you to really focus on what we can do to help you. As Jody said, really good communication really helps here to allow us really to work out a plan that suits you individually, because that is the point. We recognize everyone's individual. There is no, one size fits all concept here. So that's the idea behind that. Welfare, I couldn't agree more with what Jody says. Well-being is really important. We actually have a certificate of recognition from the Bar Council for our commitment to well-being. It is a commitment. It's not a policy. We can say we've got a policy. It's something we actually genuinely believe in. Therefore, people can contact anyone, confidentially, of course, at the ICCA regarding welfare concerns. We also have a counselling service available to students should they need it. We recognise that law is pressurised and this course is pressurised. So it's really, really important, of course, to bear that in mind. Do I think that more, or do we think that more can be done? I suspect always more can be done. But one of the reasons, of course, that we were so delighted that Jody chose to come and work with us is really bringing her experience on the ICCA Bar course, really working with her, understanding exactly what happened and how things can be improved. I can't really speak for the INS individually as to what they do. I know that they would take their individual approaches very seriously. The ICCA, even though it's the Inns of Court College of Advocacy, it is actually an independent, it's supported by the Inns of Course, but it's independent from those educational institutions. So, but please feel free to ask them, and I'm sure that they would be delighted to assist. Is there anything you'd like to add to what I've said, Jody?
I found it, again, I will reiterate what Chris has said. I talked to the ICCA and maintained a conversation through it all, because I also have other disabilities. I have dual sensory loss. So the ICCA team were amazing. I can't say it anymore. If it wasn't for their help, I wouldn't have got through the course. You know, it was just quite a reassuring and welcoming place. Everyone wanted to help, and everyone was open to having a conversation. The operations team are always there to chat to. They are quite amazing, and everyone is a friendly face. So there's no one I found that wasn't. I could always ask a question. So I think that's the most important thing. And I think from an inn perspective, I think obviously it does depend on the inn. I know my inn has a lot of neurodiverse people. I know that other inns have a lot of neurodiverse people who are part of their pension groups or their committees. So I think that they're quite interested in making the bar a more neurodiverse friendly place. But again, like with everything, it takes time. So sometimes you can only learn from the experience once you've gone through it. Sometimes, for example, I would say before I had to use a wheelchair, I wondered why light switches were halfway down the wall and it used to annoy me. And then when I was in a wheelchair looking up at a light switch, I had an entirely different perspective because now I knew why they were there. So sometimes if you're a neurodiverse person, you have to understand that the person you're speaking to might not have your experience, the same as you don't have theirs. So it's being able to put down and ask and think about what you need. And then that helps everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. If anyone has any more questions, now is the time to ask them. But it looks like I always think, Jody, you know, when I give a presentation and there's only one question at the end, and I was about to say it just means I've covered everything I need. But there is another question from Cedric. I don't have a question. I just want to express my gratitude to Jody for this excellent presentation. Very insightful and helpful. Thank you, Jody. I'm sure that everyone would echo that. Thank you very much, Cedric. I would like to, again, as I say, echo what Cedric has said. I'd like to thank all of you for attending what I think has been a really excellent presentation, and just a few other things in the last few minutes for me to say. Please come along to any further webinars that we have. If you go onto the ICCA website and you'll see a drop-down menu over the ICCA Bar Course, there's lots of excellent stuff there, not least our events page. And we have a number of events coming up on Monday, which is when our application portal opens. That's open from Monday all the way through to January. For applications for the bar course commencing either September 2025 or January 2026. I really struggle to think that far ahead. But yes, that's how it works. You can look on the application process page, but I'm also doing a webinar on Monday with Jody, all about the application process. So you can ask Jody about exactly what her experience of that was like. And I promise you, I don't send scripts to Jody as to what to say. So
dare I say?
So that would be really helpful. We've got another one coming up also on the 1st of November on preparing for bar course advocacy. And that's got our two lead criminal and civil tutors at the ICCA who are running that, who will really help you with hints and tips about advocacy. We've got an open day coming up. We've got the Bar Council Pupillage Fair coming up. And actually this afternoon, Jody and I are going to the Legal Cheek virtual pupillage fair. So if you want to come and speak to us there, please do. There's an awful lot happening. Just leaves me to say, thank you so much and see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.